The park buzzed with the usual hum of life. Children's laughter echoing from the playground, joggers pacing by with rhythmic steps, and the occasional bark from dogs chasing after frisbees. It was a sanctuary for many, but for Sarah Mitchell, it was more than just a quiet escape. It was the one place she felt truly connected to the world despite the darkness that had enveloped her life 5 years ago. Seated on her favorite weathered bench under the sprawling branches of an old oak tree, Sarah tilted her face toward the breeze, her other senses compensating for the one she'd lost. In her hand, she held the leash of Bud, her loyal German shepherd guide dog. Bud wasn't just her companion. He was her lifeline, her protector in a world she could no longer see. With every step she took, Bud ensured she moved confidently, safely, and without fear. But today, something was different. Bud wasn't his usual calm and composed self. His ears twitched at every sound, his body taut as his sharp eyes scanned the park. Sarah could feel the tension in the leash as he stayed alert, almost as if anticipating trouble. "What's wrong, boy?" she asked softly, running her fingers over his head. Bud let out a low growl, his warning unmistakable. Across the park, leaning against a sleek black motorcycle, was Hank McCoy, dressed in a leather jacket and sporting tattoos that crept up his neck. Hank's presence was hard to miss. He was surrounded by a small group of equally rough-looking bikers, their laughter loud and carefree as they passed around a cigarette. Hank, with his shaved head and bulky frame, had a natural knack for drawing attention, not just because of his size, but because of his demeanor. He was a man who thrived on control and intimidation, using it to mask the insecurities he refused to face. Hank's gaze swept over the park, stopping on Sarah. Something about her peaceful presence, her serene face turned toward the wind, the disciplined posture of her guide dog, rubbed him the wrong way. Maybe it was the way she seemed untouchable, unbothered by the chaos of life, or maybe it was just the itch to prove something to himself. Whatever it was, Hank smirked and flicked his cigarette to the ground, crushing it under his boot. "Look at that," he sneered, loud enough for his friends to hear. "A princess and her perfect little dog." His buddies chuckled, egging him on, and that was all Hank needed. With heavy boots thudding against the pavement, he started making his way toward Sarah, his eyes fixed on her like a predator sizing up its prey. Bud's ears perked, and his growl grew louder, a sound that sent a shiver through Sarah's body. She couldn't see what was happening, but she could sense the shift in energy, the footsteps growing closer, the growing unease in Bud. Everything told her someone was approaching, and it wasn't friendly. "Hey there!" Hank's voice broke through the noise of the park, dripping with mockery. "Nice dog you got. Does he do tricks? Roll over? Jump through hoops for you?" Sarah tightened her grip on Bud's leash, her heart pounding. "Leave us alone," she said firmly, masking the fear building in her chest. Her voice didn't waver, but inside, she braced herself. Hank ignored her words, clapping his hands loudly to provoke the dog. Bud's growl deepened, his body stiffening as he positioned himself between Sarah and the approaching man. "Oh, tough guy, huh?" Hank taunted, taking another step closer. "Let's see how tough." Around them, a few passers-by slowed down, their attention drawn to the unfolding scene. No one stepped in, just murmurs, glances, and the distant sound of someone pulling out a phone. Hank fed off the attention, his smirk growing wider. "What's the matter, princess? Afraid your little mutt can't handle me?" Bud, however, wasn't just any dog. Before becoming Sarah's guide, he had served as a K-9 in high-risk combat missions, trained to take down threats with precision and speed. Years of discipline had taught him to remain composed, but the instincts of a warrior still lingered, buried deep. And today they were beginning to surface. Hank raised his foot, aiming a mock kick toward Bud. "Let's see what he's got," he sneered. The growl that erupted from Bud was unlike anything Sarah had ever heard, a deep, guttural warning that sent a ripple of tension through the air. She cried out, "Don't you dare," her voice trembling with both fear and anger. But Hank, emboldened by the murmurs of the crowd, only grinned. He didn't realize he was on the verge of making a grave mistake, a mistake that would reveal Bud's true nature in front of everyone. The park fell silent. All eyes were on them. The air was thick with anticipation as Bud locked his sharp gaze on Hank, his body coiled like a spring, ready to act. What happened next would leave the entire park frozen in shock, and Hank questioning everything he thought he knew. Hank stood there, his confidence radiating outward as if the world revolved around his bravado. The smirk on his face didn't falter as he brought his foot closer to Bud, clearly expecting the dog to cower or retreat. But Bud didn't flinch. His growl wasn't a sound of fear. It was a warning, a line that Hank was dangerously close to crossing. Sarah's grip on the leash tightened so hard that her knuckles turned white. She could feel Bud's tension through the leash, the way his body braced itself for what was coming. "I said leave us alone," she repeated, her voice louder this time, laced with desperation. She couldn't see Hank's face, but she didn't need to. She could hear the malice in his voice and the arrogance in his steps. For Sarah, this wasn't just another confrontation. Her life had changed drastically 5 years ago when an accident stole her sight. Navigating the world had gone from second nature to a constant challenge. But Bud had given her the confidence to step outside again, to walk through the park she loved without fear. He wasn't just her guide. He was her lifeline. And now this man, this stranger, was threatening the very being she trusted more than anyone else. Across the park, the small crowd watching the scene unfold grew larger. A woman whispered, someone should do something, but no one moved. People stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene or just observe from a distance. A few had their phones out, recording the standoff as if they were watching a show, not a moment that could escalate dangerously at any second. Bud, however, wasn't concerned with the crowd. His entire focus was on Hank, his sharp eyes locked onto the man's movements, analyzing every twitch of his body. Years of training honed in combat zones hadn't faded from Bud's instincts. They were just buried, waiting for a moment like this. And now, faced with a threat to his handler, those instincts began to rise to the surface. Hank laughed, the sound loud and sharp, raking through the heavy silence. "What's the matter, Mutt? You're all bark and no bite," he mocked, his tone dripping with cruelty. He leaned closer, towering over Sarah and Bud, trying to assert his dominance. What Hank didn't understand, what he couldn't possibly know, was that Bud wasn't just a guide dog. He wasn't a mutt to be taunted or a pet to be scared off. Before Sarah, Bud had been Bravo, a canine who had served in some of the most dangerous environments imaginable. He had been trained to neutralize threats, to protect his handler at all costs, and to stay calm under pressure. And right now, he wasn't facing a man who could intimidate him. He was facing a threat. Sarah could feel the leash trembling in her hands, not from fear, but from the restrained power in Bud's body. She whispered, "Stay with me, Bud," her voice a mix of pleading and reassurance. She knew he wouldn't act unless it was absolutely necessary, but she could sense how close they were to that point. Hank took another step forward, his boot hovering too close to Bud's side. "Come on, show me what you've got," he taunted, his voice louder now, as if feeding off the attention of the growing crowd. He clapped his hands again, leaning in, daring the dog to react. And then he did it. Hank's foot moved in, a deliberate, mocking kick aimed not to hurt, but to provoke. But to Bud it was enough. In a split second, Bud sprang into action, his movement so fast it was almost a blur. The deep, commanding bark that erupted from him startled everyone in the park. His body moved with precision, sidestepping the kick and planting himself firmly between Hank and Sarah, his sharp teeth bared, his growl now a guttural roar. Bud made it clear that this wasn't a game anymore. Hank stumbled back, caught off guard by the sudden shift. "Whoa, easy there," he said, his voice suddenly lacking the confidence it had moments before. The crowd gasped audibly, some stepping closer to get a better look, while others whispered anxiously about what might happen next. Sarah felt Bud's movement through the leash, her heart pounding. "Bud," she whispered, unsure if he'd gone too far or if he was simply doing what he was trained to do. But Bud didn't look back at her. His entire focus was still on Hank, His eyes locked onto the man with an intensity that made it clear any further move would have serious consequences. "What's this dog's problem?" Hank muttered, his bravado faltering. He glanced around at the crowd, now very aware that all eyes were on him. For the first time, he seemed to realize that he wasn't in control of the situation anymore. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made every second feel like an eternity. Bud didn't relax, his body still coiled, his stance unwavering. He wasn't just defending Sarah, he was sending a message. And then, through the crowd, a new voice cut through the tension. "What's going on here?" It was firm, authoritative, and immediately commanding attention. A man in a park ranger uniform stepped forward, his presence immediately shifting the dynamics of the scene. Hank froze, his bravado completely gone now. The crowd began murmuring louder, some pointing to the ranger, others whispering about what had just happened. The ranger's sharp eyes took in the scene quickly. Sarah clutching the leash of a tense German shepherd, the nervous stance of Hank, and the murmuring crowd surrounding them. "Is there a problem here?" the ranger asked, his tone making it clear that he expected an answer, and quickly. Hank hesitated, his tough guy act crumbling under the weight of public judgment and the presence of authority. "I was just messing around," he muttered, raising his hands defensively. The dog overreacted, but the ranger wasn't buying it. He turned his gaze to Sarah and Bud, his expression softening as he took in the way Bud stood protectively in front of her, his growl still rumbling quietly. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Sarah nodded, her voice trembling. "We're fine," but he wouldn't stop. "Bud was just protecting me." The ranger's eyes narrowed as he turned back to Hank. "Threatening a guide dog isn't just reckless, it's illegal," he said firmly. "You'd better have a good explanation." The crowd murmured in agreement, their sympathy now clearly leaning towards Sarah and Bud. But Hank wasn't the only one about to learn something. What neither the ranger nor the crowd realized was that Bud wasn't just any dog. The truth was about to come to light, and it would leave everyone speechless. The ranger's stern gaze didn't waver as he addressed Hank. "You think harassing a guide dog is something to laugh about? This isn't a joke, son. What you did could have caused serious harm to her and the dog." Hank shifted uncomfortably, the weight of the growing crowd's judgment pressing down on him. He raised his hands in mock surrender. All right, he grumbled. "I was just messing around. No harm done, right?" But Sarah's trembling voice cut through his weak defense. "No harm," she repeated, her tone filled with disbelief. "You threatened my dog, my guide. You tried to provoke him. Do you have any idea what that's like for someone like me?" For the first time, the crowd truly seemed to absorb the gravity of the situation. People murmured, exchanging glances. Sarah's vulnerability was no longer just a background detail. It was front and center. Bud, still standing protectively in front of Sarah, let out a low growl, his focus locked on Hank. It was as though he sensed the tension hadn't completely dissipated, as if he knew Hank's retreat was only temporary. The ranger leaned in closer to Hank, his voice dropping to a low, firm tone. "Here's the thing about guide dogs. They're not just pets. They're lifelines. You mess with them, you're messing with the safety and independence of someone who depends on them to survive. And you're lucky this dog didn't tear you apart." The mention of Bud's restraint made Sarah's heart ache. She reached down, her hand brushing over Bud's head, his fur warm and steady beneath her touch. "Good boy," she whispered softly, her voice trembling with gratitude. Hank took a step back, his bravado faltering further. "I didn't mean anything by it," he mumbled, his eyes darting between Bud, Sarah, and the ranger. But the ranger wasn't letting him off that easily. "Didn't mean anything," the ranger shot back. "Let me explain something to you. If that dog had reacted differently, if he'd attacked you, he'd be the one facing consequences, not you. And all because you couldn't leave well enough alone." Hank opened his mouth to respond, but the sound of a new voice interrupted him. It was deeper, older, and carried a weight of authority that made everyone turn. "That's no ordinary guide dog," the man said, stepping forward from the crowd. He was dressed simply, wearing a worn military cap that immediately caught Sarah's attention. "That's a K9. I'd bet my pension on it." The crowd buzzed with intrigue, their attention snapping back to Bud. The ranger's eyebrows raised in surprise. But it was Sarah who spoke first, her voice quiet but steady. "What do you mean?" she asked, tilting her head in the direction of the voice. The older man stepped closer, nodding toward Bud. "That dog isn't just trained to guide. Look at the way he carries himself, the discipline, the focus. I've seen dogs like him before. He's been in combat, hasn't he?" Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Combat? But the thought seemed almost impossible. But then she remembered how he had acted in the park just moments ago. Calculated, precise, fearless. The ranger studied Bud carefully, the gears turning in his mind. "You might be right," he murmured. "That kind of behavior doesn't come from standard training." Sarah crouched beside Bud, her hand resting gently on his back. "He's always been different," she admitted softly. "Calm, disciplined. But I didn't know." The older man nodded knowingly. "Dogs like him don't lose that edge. It's buried deep, waiting for the moment it's needed. And today," he said, gesturing toward Hank, "he thought it was needed." Hank looked between the man, Sarah, and Bud, his expression a mix of confusion and unease. "You're saying this dog's some kind of soldier?" The man turned to him, his gaze sharp. "That's exactly what I'm saying. And you're lucky he held back. Dogs like him are trained to neutralize threats, not play games." For a moment, Hank looked like he might argue, but the weight of the man's words and the crowd's growing murmurs kept him silent. Sarah's mind raced. The idea that Bud, her gentle, dependable guide dog, had a past she knew nothing about was almost too much to process. She felt a pang of guilt. How could she have been so blind to the signs? The ranger straightened up, addressing the crowd. "All right, folks, that's enough for today. Show's over." His tone left no room for argument, and slowly, the onlookers began to disperse, though not without a few lingering glances at Bud. As the crowd thinned, the older man lingered, his gaze still fixed on Bud. "If you want to know more about your dog," he said to Sarah, "you should reach out to a veterans organization. They might be able to track his history." Sarah nodded, her mind still spinning. "Thank you," she said quietly. The man tipped his cap and walked away, leaving Sarah, Bud, and the ranger alone with Hank. The ranger looked at Hank one last time, his eyes narrowing. "I suggest you leave. Now." Hank didn't need to be told twice. With one last glance at Bud, he turned and walked away, his shoulders hunched, his swagger long gone. As silence settled over the park, Sarah stood there, her hand still resting on Bud's back. Her heart was pounding, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and curiosity. Who was Bud before he came into her life? And what had he seen, endured, and survived to become the dog she relied on every day? One thing was certain. Her understanding of Bud and their bond had just changed forever. The silence in the park lingered long after Hank's retreat, but Sarah's mind was anything but quiet. As she walked home with Bud by her side, her thoughts raced. Who was Bud? No, bravo. Before he came into her life, the word combat replayed in her head, an echo that made her stomach churn with a mix of awe and unease. Back at her small apartment, Sarah sat on the edge of her couch, staring down at Bud as he lay at her feet. He seemed as calm as ever, his steady breathing and relaxed posture the picture of tranquility. But Sarah now saw him differently. This wasn't just the dog who guided her through crosswalks and kept her safe from uneven sidewalks. This was a dog who had once faced dangers she couldn't even imagine. The memory of the older man's words in the park lingered. Dogs like him don't lose that edge. It explained so much, his hyper-awareness, his instinctive ability to shield her from harm, the way he seemed to understand situations before she even sensed a threat. Yet, it also left her with a gnawing question. Was he happy? Did he miss the life he had before? That night, sleep didn't come easily. Sarah tossed and turned, her thoughts spinning in circles. What if Bud was silently longing for the structure and intensity of his past life? What if she wasn't giving him the life he truly deserved? The next morning, Sarah's determination outweighed her doubts. She reached for her laptop and began researching. It didn't take long for her to find an organization dedicated to retired military and service dogs. She dialed the number, her hands trembling slightly as she explained Bud's story to the woman on the other end. "He sounds remarkable," the woman said warmly. "We have ways of looking into his past if you'd like. Many of these dogs have unique histories that deserve to be honored." "Please," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to know more." The woman promised to investigate and get back to her, but the conversation left Sarah with more questions than answers. If Bud's past was as extraordinary as it seemed, how could she ever live up to what he had once been? Days passed, and Sarah couldn't shake the unease that clung to her. She tried to go about her routine, but every time she held Bud's leash, she felt a weight she hadn't noticed before. It wasn't just about trust anymore. It was about responsibility. The stakes were raised even further when she received a call from the same woman at the organization. "Miss Mitchell, we found something," she said. "Your dog's ID matches a retired K-9 named Bravo. He served in active combat zones alongside Sergeant Jake Carter. They completed several missions together before Bravo retired from service." The name Bravo hit Sarah like a wave. It felt distant yet familiar, as though it had always been a part of him, but hidden just beneath the surface. "Did you say Sergeant Carter?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Yes," the woman confirmed. "Sergeant Carter is retired now, living in Montana. If you're interested, I can provide his contact information. He might have more to share about Bravo's past." Sarah hesitated, the phone clutched tightly in her hand. Reaching out to Sergeant Carter could open a door to the answers she craved, but it could also mean unearthing painful memories for a man who had clearly lived through more than most people could imagine. Finally, she made the decision. "Please send me his contact information," she said, her voice steadier now. When the call ended, Sarah sat quietly for a long time. Bud rested his head on her lap, his warm presence grounding her in the moment. "Bravo," she murmured, running her fingers through his fur. "Who were you before me? And what have you given up for me?" But Sarah's internal conflict wasn't the only challenge she faced. Word of the incident in the park had spread, thanks to a few viral videos recorded by onlookers. The footage, showing Hank's aggression and Bud's commanding response, had sparked widespread attention online. Comments poured in, ranging from admiration for Bud's bravery to outrage over Hank's behavior. Among the reactions, however, was an unsettling twist. Hank wasn't going to let the humiliation slide. His pride had been bruised, and the viral attention only made it worse. He began spreading his own version of the story, twisting the narrative to paint himself as the victim. "He's dangerous," Hank said in a video posted to his social media. "That dog is a menace, and the owner has no control over him. He could have attacked me for no reason." The video gained traction, with some people siding with Hank and questioning whether Sarah could handle a dog with such a powerful past. The backlash was small at first, but it grew, and Sarah found herself at the center of a controversy she never asked for. Now, not only was she grappling with the truth about Bud's past, but she was also facing scrutiny from strangers who didn't understand the bond they shared. Through it all, Bud remained by her side, his calm demeanor unshaken. But Sarah knew they were on the brink of something much bigger, and for the first time, she wasn't sure if she could protect him the way he had always protected her. The sound of another notification pulled Sarah from her thoughts. Her phone screen lit up, another video of Hank, his voice dripping with self-righteous indignation. "She's letting a dog like that run loose in public," Hank said to the camera, his tone deliberately accusatory. "What happens when he snaps? People need to know the truth before someone gets hurt." The video cut to a clip of Bud standing his ground in the park, growling at Hank. Taken out of context, it painted a damning picture. Sarah clenched her jaw, her grip tightening on the phone as frustration bubbled inside her. The comments were worse. Strangers who hadn't been there speculated about her competence, Bud's temperament, and whether dogs with military training belonged in civilian life. Her heart sank as she read the words. She felt like she was failing Bud, like she was letting the world misunderstand him. He wasn't dangerous. He was disciplined, loyal, and protective. But how could she prove that to people who only saw a few seconds of his actions? As if sensing her unease, Bud approached and rested his head on her knee. She looked down at him, the warmth of his presence grounding her in the moment. "We'll figure this out," she whispered, stroking his fur. "You've been there for me through everything. I'm not letting them take that from us." But as determined as Sarah was, the pressure was mounting. The next day, she received an unexpected call from the park ranger who had intervened. His tone was firm but kind. "Miss Mitchell, I've been hearing some noise about what happened that day. Hank's stirring things up, and a few people are questioning whether a dog like Bud is a liability." Sarah's chest tightened. "But Bud didn't do anything wrong. He was protecting me." "I know that," the ranger said, "and most people see that too. But this situation is getting attention, and it might be wise to get ahead of it. Maybe consider sharing Bud's story, the real one. Let people know who he is and what he's done." The suggestion lingered in Sarah's mind long after the call ended. Sharing Bud's story meant opening up about his past, about Bravo. It meant exposing herself to more scrutiny, more questions, and the possibility that people might still misunderstand. But it also meant giving Bud the recognition he deserved, showing the world the hero she knew him to be. The decision weighed heavily on her. That evening, as she sat on the floor beside Bud, she picked up her phone and dialed Sergeant Jake Carter's number. She'd been putting off the call, unsure if she was ready to face the full truth of Bud's past. But now, it felt like the only way forward. The phone rang twice before a deep, gravelly voice answered. "This is Jake." Sarah took a deep breath, steadying her nerves. "Sergeant Carter, this is Sarah Mitchell. I think I have your old K9 Bravo." There was a long pause, and when Jake finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Bravo. Are you serious? I thought I'd never hear about him again." "I didn't know about his past until recently," Sarah said softly. "But now, I think I need your help. People are questioning him, and I need to know his story. I need to protect him." Jake's voice grew steady, resolute. "You're right. People need to understand what dogs like him have done, and why they're more than just animals. I'll do whatever I can to help." As the call ended, Sarah felt a flicker of hope. She didn't have all the answers yet, but she knew one thing. She wasn't going to let Bud's legacy be tarnished. Whatever came next, she and Bud would face it together. The tension was building, the lines being drawn. Sarah wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for the truth, for Bud's honor, and for the bond that had become her lifeline. The morning sun spilled through the thin curtains of Sarah's apartment, but the warmth did little to ease the growing weight on her shoulders. She had spent the last few days replaying her call with Sergeant Jake Carter, his words echoing in her mind. People need to understand what dogs like him have done, and why they're more than just animals. It wasn't just Bud's story she needed to share. It was the story of every service dog who had risked everything, only to face ignorance or misunderstanding in their retirement. But knowing the stakes didn't make the task easier. Sarah's phone buzzed again, another comment notification from one of Hank's videos. She didn't bother opening it this time. The negativity was suffocating, and she knew there was no reasoning with people who were determined to see Bud as a threat. Yet, amidst the noise, there was also an outpouring of support. Strangers had reached out to share their own stories about service animals, about how dogs like Bud had saved lives and changed them forever. For every hateful comment, there was someone who understood, someone who believed in Bud, and that gave Sarah the strength to keep going. That evening, she decided to meet Hank head-on. Not physically, but publicly. With the help of Jake, she began drafting a statement, a detailed recount of Bud's past and the events that had unfolded in the park. She included everything: Bud's history as Bravo, his service alongside Jake, and the disciplined, protective instincts that had made him the dog he was today. Jake even provided photos of their time together in the field, images that spoke louder than words about the kind of dog Bud was. Once the post was live, Sarah braced herself for the reaction. The comments began pouring in almost immediately. At first, there were the usual naysayers, people questioning her motives or dismissing her as overly dramatic. But then something shifted. "Wait, that dog's a military hero," one comment read, "and some guy tried to kick him." "Are you kidding me?" Another person chimed in. "I saw the video of that guy in the park. The dog didn't attack. He was protecting her. That's what they're trained to do." The tide was turning. stories began surfacing from people who had served with K-9 units or had witnessed their impact firsthand. The narrative Hank had tried to control was slipping through his fingers, and for the first time, Sarah felt like she wasn't fighting this battle alone. But just as she began to feel a sense of relief, the stakes were raised again. A news station picked up the story, framing it as a debate: are retired service dogs a danger in civilian life? Sarah's stomach dropped as she watched the segment, which included clips of Hank's videos alongside footage of Bud's disciplined stance in the park. The anchor speculated about the challenges of integrating retired service animals into society, and though they didn't take a definitive stance, the framing made Bud sound like a ticking time bomb. The phone calls began soon after. A local reporter wanted to interview Sarah. Advocacy groups reached out, some offering support while others questioned whether Bud was suited for his role as a guide dog. And then there was the message from Hank himself, dripping with condescension. "Looks like you've made a big deal out of nothing," he wrote. "But don't worry. People will see the truth eventually." Sarah's hands shook as she read the message. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about Bud. She needed to clear his name, to prove that he wasn't the problem Hank was trying to make him out to be. The next morning, Sarah received an unexpected call from Jake. "I've been watching what's happening," he said, his voice steady. "You're doing everything right, but I think it's time I stepped in." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, her heart pounding. "I mean it's time for people to hear the whole story," Jake said. "Not just from you, but from me. I'm flying out tomorrow. We're going to set the record straight." Sarah's breath caught. Jake's willingness to step into the spotlight was a game changer. He wasn't just a voice of authority. He was someone who had lived through the trials of war, with Bud by his side. The day of Jake's arrival was a whirlwind. As Sarah waited with Bud at her apartment, she couldn't shake the nerves buzzing under her skin. Would Jake's presence be enough to sway public opinion? Would people believe him? Or had Hank's narrative already done too much damage? When the knock finally came, Sarah opened the door to see Jake standing there, a sturdy man with a weathered face and piercing eyes. But his expression softened the moment he saw Bud. "Bravo," Jake said quietly, his voice breaking. Bud's ears perked up, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, as if recognizing his old friend, Bud stepped forward, his tail wagging slightly, and let out a soft whine. Jake knelt, his hands trembling as he stroked Bud's head. "You remember me," he murmured, tears glistening in his eyes. "I never forgot you, boy." Sarah watched the reunion with a lump in her throat. It wasn't just a meeting of two old friends. It was a turning point, a moment that would change everything. Jake was here to fight for Bud, and together, they would face whatever came next. The reunion between Jake and Bud was more than just emotional. It was transformative. As Jake knelt beside Bud, stroking his fur and whispering words of reassurance, Sarah could see the connection between them. It was as if the years and miles that had separated them had dissolved in an instant. Bud leaned into Jake's touch, his tail wagging steadily now, and for the first time in days, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. But there was still a battle to be fought. Jake didn't waste time. "We need to go public with this," he said, his voice firm as he stood up. "People need to see the truth about Bud, about what he's done, and why he reacted the way he did in the park. I know how these dogs think because I trained with them. They don't act out of aggression. They act to protect." Sarah hesitated. "But what if people don't believe us? What if it just makes things worse?" "They'll believe us," Jake said confidently, "because we'll show them who Bud really is." The following day, Sarah and Jake sat side by side in front of a local reporter's camera. Jake shared everything: how he and Bravo had worked together in some of the most dangerous conditions imaginable, how Bud's instincts had saved lives, and how his training as a military K-9 had shaped him into the disciplined and loyal dog he was today. Jake's words carried a weight that couldn't be ignored. His voice cracked when he recounted the moments Bravo had pulled him from danger, the missions that would have gone sideways if not for the dog at his side. Sarah spoke next, her voice trembling but steady. She shared how Bud had changed her life, giving her independence and security after losing her sight. "He's not just my guide," she said, her hand resting on Bud's head. He's my protector, my partner, and my friend. He's saved me more times than I can count. Not because he had to, but because that's who he is. The video was released that evening, and the response was immediate. Thousands of comments poured in, many expressing admiration and support. "This dog is a hero," one person wrote. Another added, "I had no idea what these dogs go through. Bravo deserves respect." But not everyone was convinced. Hank, fueled by bitterness, doubled down, posting another video accusing Sarah and Jake of spinning a sob story. His words were sharp, but the tides had turned against him. People called him out in the comments, questioning his behavior and criticizing his attempt to smear a dog that had done nothing but protect his handler. The turning point came when one of Jake's old military contacts reached out, offering to corroborate his story. Soon, other veterans who had worked with K9S began sharing their experiences online, flooding social media with stories of the bravery and loyalty of dogs like Bud. The narrative Hank had tried to control was no longer his. It belonged to Bud now. The pressure grew until Hank deleted his videos and disappeared from the conversation altogether. For Sarah, it was a relief, but it was also a reminder of how fragile perception could be. It took the voices of strangers, veterans, and a man who had trusted Bud with his life to set the record straight. As the dust began to settle, Sarah looked at Bud, who was lying at her feet, calm and steady as always. She smiled and whispered, "We made it, Bud. Together." The days following the video's release felt like a whirlwind for Sarah. What had started as a moment of fear and humiliation in the park had transformed into something far greater, a chance to shed light on the incredible bond between humans and their service animals. The support that poured in from people around the world was overwhelming. Messages from veterans, guide dog handlers, and even strangers who had simply been moved by the story filled Sarah's inbox. For the first time, Sarah felt like she wasn't alone. The negativity from Hank's videos had been drowned out by an outpouring of love and respect for Bud, no Bravo, and his remarkable journey. But for Sarah, this wasn't just about setting the record straight. It was about understanding her own relationship with Bud on a deeper level. One quiet afternoon, Sarah sat on her couch, Bud lying at her feet, as he often did. She gently ran her fingers through his thick fur, reflecting on everything they had been through together. "You've been carrying so much, haven't you?" she said softly, her voice tinged with emotion. "You've always been there for me, even when I didn't realize what you'd already given." Bud, as if sensing her thoughts, lifted his head and nudged her hand. It was a small gesture, but it reminded Sarah of the quiet strength he always carried, steady, unshakable, and full of purpose. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. When she opened it, Jake stood there, holding a small box. "I thought you'd like this," he said, stepping inside. Sarah invited him to sit, and he placed the box on the table, his expression both warm and solemn. Inside the box were mementos from Bud's past life, photos of him in his K9 vest, a medal he had received for his service, and a faded patch with the name Bravo stitched across it. Sarah picked up the patch, her fingers tracing the letters. "This was his name," she said softly, her voice catching. "It feels so strange to think of him as anything other than Bud." Jake smiled. "He'll always be Bud to you," he said. "But that name, Bravo, it's a part of him too. It's the part of him that made him who he is today." Sarah nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I never thought I'd learn so much about him," she said. "I've always trusted him, but now it feels like I know him in a completely different way." Jake leaned back, his gaze thoughtful. "Dogs like Bravo don't just serve, they bond. They give everything they have to the people they care about. And from what I've seen, you're giving him exactly what he needs, a new purpose." The words stayed with Sarah long after Jake left. She thought about how Bud had adapted to her life, how he had become her protector and partner, and she realized that she had given him something, too, a chance to be loved and valued in a different way. The next weekend, Sarah and Jake took Bud to the training facility they had visited before. As Bud ran through the obstacle courses, his movements sharp and precise, Sarah watched with a mix of pride and gratitude. He was thriving, finding joy and fulfillment in every task. But more than that, He was still her Bud, the dog who had chosen to stay by her side through it all. After the session, the trainer approached Sarah, smiling. "He's exceptional," she said. "But what's even more exceptional is the bond you two share. It's rare to see a dog this disciplined also be so gentle and connected to his handler." Sarah smiled, her hand resting on Bud's head. "He's not just my guide," she said. "He's my partner." As they walked home that evening, the sky painted with hues of orange and pink, Sarah felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in weeks. The storm of doubt and conflict that had surrounded her and Bud had finally passed, leaving behind something stronger, a bond that had only deepened through the challenges they had faced together. "Bud," she said quietly as they reached their front door. "Or should I say Bravo? No matter what anyone says, you'll always be my hero." Bud looked up at her, his warm brown eyes steady and full of trust. And in that moment, Sarah knew they had both found what they needed. Not just a guide or a protector, but a true and unwavering partnership. In the weeks that followed, life for Sarah and Bud settled into a new rhythm. The storm of attention surrounding the incident in the park had finally quieted, but its impact lingered in unexpected ways. Messages of support continued to trickle in, not just for Sarah, but for Bud as well. Veterans who had worked with K-9 units reached out to share stories, some even recognizing Bravo's name from missions they had served on. Advocacy groups for retired service animals contacted Sarah, offering their support and resources. But it wasn't just the external support that mattered. It was the internal transformation that Sarah felt every time she held Bud's leash or ran her fingers through his fur. She no longer thought of him as simply a guide dog. He was so much more than that. Bud had carried a history of loyalty, bravery, and sacrifice, and somehow, despite the weight of it all, he had chosen her. One crisp morning, Sarah and Bud returned to the park where it all began. The memories of that day still lingered, but they no longer felt sharp or painful. Instead, they reminded Sarah of how far they'd come and how much they had overcome together. As they walked, Sarah heard the sound of children laughing and birds chirping in the distance, familiar sounds that filled the space around her. Bud's leash was steady in her hand, his steps confident beside hers. They reached the bench under the old oak tree, their spot, and Sarah sat down, feeling the cool breeze brush against her face. "Do you remember this place, Bud?" she asked softly. Bud leaned against her leg, his weight grounding her in the moment. "This is where everything changed. For a while, I thought it was for the worse, but now I see it differently. It was a turning point, wasn't it? For both of us." Bud let out a soft huff, his tail thumping gently against the ground. Sarah smiled, feeling the familiar comfort of his presence. "You've taught me so much," she continued, her voice warm. "Not just about trust, but about strength. About what it means to stand by someone, no matter what." A passing jogger slowed down, noticing them. "Hey," the jogger said, his tone curious, but kind. "Is that the dog from the videos? The one everyone's been talking about?" Sarah nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "This is Bud," she said, "or Bravo, depending on who you ask." The jogger chuckled, giving a little wave before continuing on his way. Sarah leaned back on the bench, letting the moment wash over her. Bud's name, his story, his past, they were all out in the world now. And while it had been daunting at first, she realized it had given her something she didn't expect, a deeper connection to the dog who had become her everything. As the sun began to rise higher in the sky, Sarah stood and adjusted her grip on Bud's leash. "Ready to head home, partner?" she asked. Bud responded with a gentle nudge against her leg, his steady loyalty shining through in every movement. Together, they walked back down the familiar path, their steps in sync, their bond unshaken. For Sarah, Bud wasn't just a guide dog or a former K-9 hero. He was proof that even in the darkest moments, the right companion could light the way forward. And for Bud, Sarah wasn't just a handler. She was his mission, his purpose, and his home. And that was all either of them needed.